Grace adjusted her scarf and settled into her plush first-class seat with an air of quiet dignity, unaware that her life was about to be shattered by cruelty and discrimination so raw it would awaken a long-dormant spirit of retribution. From the moment she stepped aboard the jet, there was an unspoken tension in the cabin. It wasn't until a sharply dressed flight attendant, whose icy eyes betrayed a disdain born of prejudice, noticed her, that everything changed. Without a word of warning or explanation, this woman, Ava, delivered a swift, brutal slap across Grace's face. The sound echoed through the lavish cabin filled with hushed whispers and wide, incredulous stares. In that instant, Grace's world shattered, replaced by a searing humiliation that burned her cheek and chilled her heart. Ava's actions were not random. They were calculated, designed to humiliate Grace in front of an audience too paralyzed by fear and conformity to intervene. The cruelty in Ava's eyes was matched only by the cold indifference of everyone around her. At the same moment, a man seated just one row behind, Nathan Hale, kept his gaze fixed on the unfolding drama. Known in certain circles as someone with the power to dismantle an entire airline with a single phone call, Nathan's stillness masked the storm brewing within him. He was not merely a silent observer. His silence was a precursor to an exquisite, meticulously planned retribution that would soon shake the very foundations of the establishment. Grace, whose access to first class had not been earned by her own merit but granted by a mysterious benefactor whose influence transcended ordinary social standings, had always maintained a modest demeanor. Dressed in a simple cream sweater, light denim jeans, and pristine white sneakers, she had chosen simplicity over ostentation. Her blonde hair was neatly tied back, and she wore no makeup, presenting the unassuming image of a woman who had long been accustomed to being overlooked. But beneath that calm exterior lay a reservoir of resilience and an unyielding belief in justice, a belief that was about to be ignited by the injustice she suffered. When Ava's stern demand for Grace to stand rang out, the tension in the cabin thickened. Grace's voice, trembling yet steady, affirmed the validity of her ticket, but her words were drowned out by Ava's rising hostility and the intoxicating scent of discrimination. Ava's inquiry, laden with subtle yet cutting insinuations that first class was a realm reserved only for a certain elite, implicitly excluded outsiders like Grace. The dismissive sneer on Ava's face exposed a deep-rooted prejudice and an unyielding intent to degrade Grace, a woman who, despite her quiet strength, was now made to feel less than human. Every eye in the cabin bore witness to the unfolding spectacle, yet none dared to speak out. A middle-aged man in seat 2C stared in a mix of shock and silent judgment, while an older woman in 1A turned her gaze to the window as if hoping to escape the ugliness of the moment. Meanwhile, Nathan, sitting in seat 4B, observed with a measured calm that belied the turbulent resolve building inside him. Behind his seemingly placid exterior was a steely determination, a determination fueled by both loyalty and a burning sense of justice. In his eyes there was the promise of retribution, a promise that would soon manifest in an act of magnificent, vengeful force that those in power would never forget. Grace's heart pounded not merely from the physical blow, but from the relentless sting of racial and class-based discrimination. Every fiber of her being rebelled against the indignity forced upon her. Even as tears threatened to spill, she clutched her boarding pass, proceeding along her journey, moving from the serene comfort of first class to the confined space of coach. Her demotion from seat 3, a place of supposed honor, to the cramped confines of seat 18C was a public declaration that she did not belong in the realm of the elite. Each step down the narrow aisle was a bitter reminder of the social stigma meticulously imposed upon her by Ava and those who silently validated the act. Back in the first-class galley, Ava and her accomplice Monica exchanged disdainful remarks, their voices dripping with contempt as they speculated about the authenticity of Grace's ticket. They insinuated that her passage was counterfeit, a deceptive ploy to infiltrate their exclusive world. Their words, saturated with arrogance and racial superiority, only fueled the fire of injustice, setting the stage for a reckoning as inevitable as it was long overdue. While they laughed off the incident as a trivial inconvenience, every word they uttered deepened the wound in Grace's soul. Their cruelty was not an isolated act of individual malice, but a mirror reflecting a broader systemic bias that had long segregated the privileged from those deemed unworthy. Nathan's role in the unfolding drama was far more significant than it appeared. With a practiced air of detachment, he reached for his phone and initiated a series of secret calls to the highest echelons of power within the airline. His instructions were precise and underscored by quiet fury. He demanded immediate access to the cockpit, ensuring that every gesture carried the weight of an impending counterstrike. His actions were not solely about restoring a semblance of order. They were about sending an unmistakable message that while injustice might prevail for a moment, justice, however delayed, would soon be delivered, with a vengeance that would dismantle the very institution of elitism. For Grace, the humiliation of the day was overwhelming, a piercing cocktail of embarrassment, sorrow, and a rising desire for vindication that simmered beneath her calm exterior. Every throb on her cheek reminded her of Ava's venomous words and the stony silence of the onlookers. Yet amid this searing pain, a quiet strength began to emerge. A strength fostered by years of enduring life's adversities and a steadfast resolve to never allow an injustice to pass unchallenged. It was within that crucible of suffering that the spark of defiance was forged. A spark that would soon grow into a roaring blaze of resistance, one so brilliant and fierce that it would force every oppressor to reckon with the consequences of their cruelty. What transpired next was not a mere quest for personal redemption. It was the launching of an intricate counteroffensive, a battle of wills and morality that would reverberate throughout the airline and beyond. Nathan Hale's discreet orchestration of events was only the opening act in what promised to be a dramatic showdown against an institution rife with prejudice and arrogance. As the plane taxied on the tarmac, Captain Reynolds scrambled to comprehend the unfolding instructions from ground operations. Every moment magnified the gravity of Ava's cruelty, and the consequences of that single vicious act began to crystallize. In that charged atmosphere, Grace's sorrow morphed into a fierce determination. Though her body ached and her pride lay shattered, her spirit gathered strength, fueled by the vision of retribution. The humiliation inflicted upon her was no longer just an act of personal affront. It had become a catalyst for a monumental reversal of fortune, a clarion call to reclaim her dignity and expose the deep-seated corruption of an elitist system. As the wheels of the airplane creaked and the engines hummed lowly against the impending backdrop of resistance, it became clear that this was not merely a passenger's ordeal. It was a battle cry for justice and respect, a movement poised to reverberate far beyond the confines of that flight. Grace, once the quiet, unassuming traveler, now found herself at the center of an unfolding drama that would challenge the very norms of a society steeped in discrimination and classism. The incident aboard that flight was an explosive beginning, one that would ultimately reshape her destiny and ignite a fire of defiance that would blaze across the skies. Every memory of the slap and every whispered insult would serve as both a scar and a source of strength, a reminder that in the battle between right and wrong, even the most humble among us could rise to claim a righteous victory. In that moment, as she gripped the armrests with trembling determination and inhaled the stale yet charged air of the cabin, Grace vowed that her humiliation would not define her. It would instead serve as the crucible in which her spirit was reborn. The cruelty she endured was transforming into an unyielding drive, a drive to exact a retribution so magnificent and sweeping that it would force even the highest towers of power to tremble in its wake. As the aircraft inched forward, readying itself for a fateful takeoff, the stage was set for a confrontation that promised to be as breathtaking as it was cathartic. In that moment, in the heart of the turbulent American skies, Grace's journey evolved from a tale of disgrace to an epic saga of defiance and retribution, destined to leave every onlooker astounded and in awe of the formidable force of justice that had finally awakened. The screen went dark, and in that charged silence, the weight of impending judgment settled like a storm over the cabin. Captain Reynolds, still reeling from what he had witnessed, leaned back in his chair as if trying to collect the shattered fragments of decorum that had once governed his every decision. With deliberate calm, he reached for the cabin intercom and commanded, "Lead attendant to cockpit, now." Outside in the confines of the bustling galley, Ava continued to refill her coffee with an uncharacteristic mechanical precision. Her practiced indifference dissolved into a fragile veneer of confidence as she stepped gingerly into the cockpit. The instant her eyes met Captain Reynolds's, the crack in her armor widened. Her usual posture of assured control faltered. The lofty air she had carried for years was rapidly replaced by an overwhelming feeling of dread. Captain Reynolds' eyes were dark pools of silent reproach as he began, voice low and measured. "Would you like to explain why a first-class passenger with a valid boarding pass was removed from her seat without proper verification?" His voice carried the weight of authority and moral indignation. Ava's mouth went dry as she fumbled for words, attempting to justify her actions. "Captain, there was a woman in 3A. She did not appear to have the correct status, and she did not respond confidently when questioned about her ticket." The words tumbled out haltingly, as though she were reciting an incantation to fend off an inevitable reckoning. The captain's gaze was steely. "I made a judgment call to avoid any delay. Did she resist you? Did she show you a valid boarding pass?" There was a pregnant pause. "Yes. But it didn't make sense," he continued, his tone rising ever so slightly as his disappointment shifted into frustration. "She was alone and did not fit the profile." He leaned forward, letting the words sink into the charged atmosphere. "Didn't fit the profile." In that moment, the familiar veneer of authority that Ava had so long relied upon crumbled beneath the relentless scrutiny. Ava's voice wavered. "I thought it was suspicious. I acted quickly to protect the cabin's integrity." The captain's retort was immediate and forceful. "You slapped her." His words cut sharply through the air, a condemnation without any room left for excuses. Ava's face drained of its usual color as she stammered, "Captain, I did not strike her without cause." The accusation hung like a guillotine poised to fall, without cause, without protocol, without any consultation with the crew or ground control, he intoned, each word measured and unforgiving. Reaching over, he tapped the screen beside him, and the name on it burned into the collective conscience. That woman was Grace Bennett. The captain's voice grew in volume and certainty. She had every right to sit in 3A. And do you know who was seated right behind her? Ava's silence was as damning as any confession, and Captain Reynolds' voice resonated with the cold truth. "Mr. Nathan Hale." His tone turned to pure steel as he continued, "You assaulted the girlfriend of the man who owns more of this airline than anyone else on the planet, and you did it in front of a full cabin." In that cramped cockpit, with every eye in the cabin attuned to what was unfolding, all the air seemed to drain from the room. Ava's legs faltered. The mountain of authority she had so ruthlessly commanded now felt like a burden too heavy to bear. I didn't know," she whispered, her voice barely audible through the tension. "That is precisely the problem," Captain Reynolds said, his voice now booming with rebuke. "You did not ask, you just acted." Rising slowly from his seat, he fixed her with an unyielding stare and issued his verdict. "You are to walk back into that cabin in front of every passenger who witnessed your act and personally escort Ms. Grace Bennett back to her seat. You will apologize, clearly, audibly, respectfully, and when we land, you will be met by executive security. Ground operations already have instructions. You will report to a disciplinary hearing the moment we touch down." His voice left no room for debate, no chance for forgiveness, only the inevitability of consequence. Ava stood paralyzed. her lips barely parting as she absorbed the weight of his words. The silence in the cockpit was suffocating, and when Captain Reynolds finished with a final, emphatic "now," Ava slowly turned and exited the cockpit, leaving behind the remnants of her former control like a forgotten uniform. He walked down the aisle of the aircraft, a passageway she had traversed countless times with authority and ease, but now each step felt laden with humiliation and a creeping terror that no amount of practiced composure could suppress. The cabin, once filled with the muted hum of casual conversation and the soft rustling of first-class luxury, now held its breath. Passengers previously engrossed in their own affairs found themselves transfixed by the unfolding drama. Every row, every seat, every pair of eyes in that opulent cabin was focused on Ava's slow, measured progress through the aisle. The sound of her shoes clicking on the floor was amplified in her ears, echoing like a death march. With every step, her once commanding presence seemed to recede further into vulnerability, replaced by the raw display of human frailty. Eventually, Ava reached the back of the cabin where Grace sat, still in seat 18C, her gaze fixed out the small window, watching the ever-changing tapestry of drifting clouds. Grace's expression was inscrutable, a stoic mask that betrayed neither anger nor fear, only the quiet resolve of a woman who had weathered more than most could ever imagine. Ava cleared her throat, her voice cracking as she began what would be her public apology. "Miss Bennet," she said, her tone faltering, "I would like to escort you back to your original seat." Grace turned slowly to face her, meeting her gaze with eyes that were steady and unyielding. There was no fury in Grace's look, no demand for immediate retribution. Instead, there was a profound stillness, as if in that moment she had become the embodiment of dignity itself. "There's been a misunderstanding," Ava continued hastily, as if trying to rewrite the narrative even as the damage was done. Grace's response was a single measured sentence that cut through the murmur of the passengers like a clarion call. "You slapped me, Ava." Her voice, though soft, reverberated powerfully throughout the cabin, silencing any further chatter and forcing every onlooker to confront the gravity of what had transpired. Ava's face burned with the simultaneous heat of shame and realization. I realize now that was a mistake," she managed to say, each word dripping with the bitterness of regret. "I sincerely apologize. I shouldn't have done that, and I'll make it right now." There was a heavy pause, and then Grace, her arms folded with quiet defiance, asked the question that had been simmering beneath the surface of every injustice in that moment. "And why did you think I didn't belong in first class in the first place?" The question hung in the air, charged with years of discrimination and the deep wounds of societal prejudice. Ava's attempt to justify her actions came out as a broken murmur. I misjudged," she whispered, barely capable of meeting Grace's unyielding gaze. The words felt as hollow as the echo of her earlier arrogance. Grace's eyes, filled with a sorrow that spoke of countless battles fought in silence, bore into Ava's soul as she spoke once more, her voice calm yet imbued with an unmistakable power. "I have the same seat, the same boarding pass. You didn't check the other passengers' tickets, you only questioned me, and you acted with a prejudice that can only be born out of a mind shaped by exclusion and disdain. Every word was an indictment of a system steeped in elitism and racial bias, a system that had relegated a dignified, capable woman like Grace to the margins simply because she did not conform to the narrow expectations of an outdated order." The passengers watched as Grace rose slowly, her posture regal despite the deep pain that must have throbbed beneath her skin. With each measured step toward the front of the plane, she seemed to reclaim not only her rightful place in first class, but also her agency and self-respect, elements that had been callously stripped away by Ava's unprovoked act of cruelty. As Grace walked past, the murmurs of disbelief turned to a profound silence, a silence heavy with shared indignation and empathetic sorrow. It was as if every person on board recognized the injustice that had unfolded, the systemic bias that had singled her out, and they silently witnessed the rebirth of a spirit that had refused to be broken. In the front of the cabin, Nathan Hale, who had watched the entire exchange with an intensity that belied his calm exterior, finally stood. He approached Grace, reaching out to gently take her hand and help her slide back into her seat. The tender gesture, devoid of fanfare but loaded with unspoken promises of retribution, spoke volumes. He brushed her cheek with the gentlest of touches, a quiet comfort amid the chaos of humiliation and despair, and Grace offered a slight nod in thanks, a nod that conveyed both gratitude and a quiet determination to rise above the indignity thrust upon her. Meanwhile, Ava retreated to the galley, her footsteps now hushed and labored, as if she were trying to hide from the very eyes that had once so readily obeyed her commands. Back in that cramped space, she leaned against the cold metal counter, her trembling hands clasping the edge as if it were the only anchor in a sinking world. Her breathing was shallow, and for the first time in her long, controlled career, she felt small and vulnerable, like a child caught in a storm of repercussions and regret. Across the galley, Monica, the junior attendant who had long observed Ava's once unassailable authority, stepped forward with cautious concern. "You okay?" Monica asked in a voice that was both neutral and firm, mirroring the quiet strength that now emanated from the heart of the cabin. Ava did not answer immediately, too consumed by the dawning reality that her power had crumbled beneath the weight of her own prejudice. Monica leaned in further, her eyes reflecting both empathy and a hint of reproach. "You know, you didn't even give her a chance. You assumed she didn't belong up here." Those words, coming from someone who had witnessed Ava's rigid enforcement of policies day in and day out, stung with the truth of an accusation long overdue. Ava mumbled a weak apology as she turned away, the defense of her misjudgment rendered feeble by the undeniable facts laid bare before everyone. In that moment, the once confident captain of the cabin was reduced to a trembling shadow of the woman she had been, her authority stripped away layer by layer like the peeling of a rotten fruit. Back in first class, Grace had resumed her seat with a quiet dignity that resonated through the cabin. She accepted the sparkling water offered by a new attendant without a word, the simple gesture underscoring her resolve to remain unbroken despite the ordeal. Around her, the atmosphere had irrevocably changed. Passengers who had once pretended not to notice now exchanged glances laden with empathy, sorrow, and a collective understanding that an injustice had taken place. A man sitting across the aisle leaned in slightly, his voice a low murmur as he confessed, "I saw what happened. That wasn't right." Grace turned her head slowly, meeting his eyes not with anger, but with a calm that belied the inner tempest. "And yet you did nothing," she replied softly, the accusation lingering in the air like a counterpoint to the silence of complicity. The man shifted in his seat, his face reflecting a dawning realization of his own indifference, and murmured, I thought it wasn't my place." Grace's response was gentle but resolute. "It was everyone's place. We all share the responsibility for justice." In a few moments, a discreet message on Nathan's phone confirmed what many had already begun to suspect. A dramatic turn of events was underway. Security had been dispatched, and the executive board had been notified of the incident. Nathan's legal advisor had warned him that, upon landing, Grace would be met by officials ready to confront the injustices of that day. Nathan silently pocketed the phone, his eyes never leaving Grace's composed figure. His expression was one of steely determination, a silent oath that the wrong done to Grace would not go unanswered. The tension reached its apex as the captain's voice finally crackled over the intercom, solemn yet resolute. "Ladies and gentlemen, we are now cleared for takeoff. Please ensure that your seatbelts are fastened, tray tables are up, and all electronic devices are in airplane mode." The announcement, intended to restore calm and order, only underscored the lingering disquiet that had taken root among the passengers. The plane began its slow, deliberate roll down the runway. Outside, the familiar hum of the engines and the vibration of the landing gear conveyed a sense of imminent escape, yet inside the cabin, the truth of what had occurred remained as palpable as ever. As the aircraft accelerated and eventually lifted off from the tarmac, the sky outside turned from a muted gray into a canvas of bright, sprawling blue, a stark contrast to the tumultuous emotions swirling inside the cabin. Passengers settled into their seats, but the echo of Ava's mistake and Grace's dignified defiance lingered like an indelible mark on every heart. The collective consciousness of the cabin had been irreversibly altered. A moment of cruelty had birthed a wave of solidarity among those who had witnessed it. For Grace, the flight had transformed from a routine journey into an arena of moral reckoning. Every inch of the cramped coach and every glance exchanged with fellow passengers spoke of an unspoken pact, one that demanded that injustice be confronted, no matter how deeply it was ingrained in the fabric of society. And as she sat there, back straight, eyes focused on a horizon that promised change, Grace felt a stirring deep within her soul, a resolve that this moment of humiliation would serve as the crucible in which her renewed strength was forged. The turbulence of the flight was no longer only a physical sensation. It was a metaphor for the turmoil that had rocked the foundations of prejudice and elitism aboard the plane. Nathan Hale, whose steady presence had guided the events with a quiet yet formidable determination, remained vigilant. His silent support, embodied in the tender care with which he had helped Grace reclaim her seat, spoke of a deeper commitment to righting the wrongs imposed by a system built on exclusion and superficial judgment. In the following moments, as the flight continued its journey across American skies, the atmosphere shifted from one of raw indignation to a simmering anticipation of retribution. Every passenger in that aircraft, whether they had actively participated in the scene or had been passive witnesses, carried within them a spark that would soon ignite into a blazing call for accountability. For Grace, her ordeal was not merely a personal tragedy. It was the embodiment of the countless injustices that had long been tolerated in society. And as the plane soared higher into the vast expanse of the sky, that spark promised to burst into a flame of retribution so magnificent and unyielding that it would resonate far beyond the confines of that single flight. There was an energy in the cabin that transcended the mere mechanics of air travel. It was an energy born from a collective awareness that something had to change. The silent accusers in every row, the compassionate glances exchanged between strangers, they all bore witness to an injustice that demanded correction. Nathan's earlier call for security, the official notifications, and the impending disciplinarian hearing were merely the first steps in a larger process, a process that would see the oppressive structures of elitism and racial bias dismantled, one oppressive act at a time. By the time the aircraft began its final descent, the quiet murmur of discontent had grown into a resolute silence, a silence that challenged the status quo and heralded the arrival of long-awaited retribution. In that final stretch before landing, every detail, from the soft hum of the engines to the measured cadence of the captain's instructions, became part of the tapestry of transformation. Grace, once relegated to the margins of society, now stood as a symbol of resilience and quiet dignity. Her journey had become a clarion call for justice, a testament to the strength of those who refuse to be defined by the cruelty of others. As the wheels of the aircraft finally made contact with the runway, the anticipation in the cabin reached its zenith. Outside, the cool evening air of an American city awaited, and with it, the promise of accountability. Nathan's silent assurance, Grace's unwavering composure, and even the subdued remorse of Ava, all wove together into a narrative of profound transformation. This was not the end of the story, but the beginning of a reckoning that would echo throughout the halls of power. For Ava, the consequences of her actions would soon crystallize into a full-blown disciplinary process. The fear and humiliation she experienced in that moment were destined to become a turning point in her life. A turning point that would expose not only her personal failings, but also the systemic prejudices that had given her a misguided sense of entitlement. And as executive security prepared to meet her at the gate, there was an unspoken understanding that the repercussions of her actions would reverberate far beyond the confines of that single flight. In that moment of shared silence, as the cabin braced itself for what was to come, Grace sat quietly, her gaze fixed on the horizon, her heart filled with both sorrow and an unyielding determination. She knew that her humiliation was only the beginning of a larger, more transformative journey, a journey that promised to dismantle the barriers of discrimination and vindicate every soul that had ever been marginalized. In that shared moment of vulnerability and resolve, the passengers of Flight 717 bore witness to an extraordinary act of defiance, a moment when the oppressed quietly declared that no more would injustice be tolerated. For the women who had experienced the kind of quiet, enduring strength that comes with age and wisdom, Grace's calm rebuke was not merely a personal triumph but a rallying cry. It was a testament that dignity, respect, and justice were worth fighting for, even in the face of overwhelming adversity. And as the plane taxied toward the terminal, every heart on board pulsed with the promise that retribution, when nurtured by truth and carried on the wings of collective determination, could indeed be a force so powerful as to leave the world in awe. Thus, in the final moments before landing, as the aircraft rolled to a stop and the engines hushed to a whisper, the stage was set for a transformation that extended far beyond that single flight. Grace's quiet strength, Nathan's determined silence, and even Ava's trembling regret had merged into a narrative that celebrated the resilience of the human spirit against injustice. It was a narrative that, when told and retold, would inspire countless others to stand up against discrimination and to demand that respect and dignity become the hallmarks of every journey, whether taken in the skies or here on solid ground. In that moment, as the cabin doors prepared to open to the waiting embrace of American soil and the promise of accountability, Grace silently vowed that her pain and her humiliation would serve as the spark that lit a flame of change, a flame that would one day burn away the vestiges of prejudice and restore justice to those who had long suffered in silence. And as the passengers began to disembark, each step they took was not merely a stride off the plane, but a step toward a future where the oppressor would one day face the full force of righteous retribution, leaving every onlooker in quiet astonishment at the power of a dignified heart that refused to be broken. Thus ends this chapter of Flight 717, a chapter marked by cruelty and humiliation, yes, but also by the undeniable emergence of a strength and resilience that would forever alter the course of every life it touched. Grace, now more than ever, stood as a beacon of hope and a living testament that even in the darkest moments, the promise of redemption, justice, and an awe-inspiring retribution could rise from the ashes of despair. The tension in the cabin had not vanished. It had only settled into a heavy, almost suffocating quiet as passengers kept their heads bowed or closed their eyes, engrossed in their own private worlds. Grace sat perfectly still in her seat, her hands folded neatly on her lap, her expression carved in stoic indifference. Though the sting of Ava's savage slap had faded from her face, the burn still echoed inside her, a constant reminder of how quickly someone could be judged, humiliated, and dismissed purely on assumptions. As she stole a glance at Nathan, she saw in his calm, unwavering eyes that he was already orchestrating a plan far beyond what anyone else could imagine. Nathan never raised his voice or stirred a scene. Instead, his silent, focused demeanor spoke of pressure applied with razor-sharp precision, exactly when needed. Back in the galley, Ava's predicament was growing unbearable. She stood stiffly behind the curtain, clinging to the remnants of authority that had once made her feel untouchable. Every moment replayed in her mind like a haunting loop. The way Grace had met her gaze without flinching, the collective silence of the passengers, and the brutal slap she had delivered without hesitation. In that instant, Ava had convinced herself she was maintaining order, protecting first class from those who, in her eyes, did not belong. But as she reluctantly pulled out her tablet and opened the crew app to review internal logs and reports, a tremor of dread rippled through her. Her spotless record, a testament to a career spent enforcing the rules, was now tainted, destined to be marred by an official notice and a call to report to corporate headquarters upon landing. Monica, a junior attendant whose quiet wisdom had earned her respect despite her relative inexperience, stepped in with a tray of drinks. "Want me to take service?" she asked softly, her tone laced with concern. Ava, unable to muster a response, could only watch as Monica's steady eyes filled with disappointment. "I used to look up to you," Monica admitted, her voice measured and sincere. "I always thought that leadership meant being sharp, precise, and unshakable." Ava's face tightened with a mix of anger and regret, for she had led this crew for years, had always prided herself on her iron control over every flight. "That's exactly why this hurts," Monica continued evenly, "because you knew better than to let a moment of prejudice override your duty." Ava's mouth opened, seeking a defense that would never come, as the weight of her own actions settled upon her like a prison uniform she could never shed. In first class, a compassionate crew member approached Grace quietly, offering a gentle inquiry. "Ms. Bennett, may I offer you anything? We have a special wine menu or perhaps something light to eat." Grace glanced briefly at the attendant and then at Nathan, who nodded in silent encouragement. "I'm fine, thank you," she murmured, her voice soft yet laden with an unspoken power that resonated with every passenger. As the attendant drifted away, Grace's phone vibrated with a new email notification from Velum Airlines' corporate office. With trembling fingers, she opened the message. The carefully worded letter acknowledged the incident, confirmed that Ava's actions were under strict review, and announced that a disciplinary hearing would occur within 48 hours. It also promised internal bias training and offered Grace a private call with the Vice President of Guest Experience. At the very end, 2 lines made her pause. "Your silence in the moment was more powerful than any words. We thank you for reminding us what dignity looks like." For Grace, those words were bittersweet. While they recognized her restraint, they underscored the injustice she had endured. Taking a long, steadying breath, Grace locked her phone and stared out into the distance. "I didn't want any of this," she whispered, her tone heavy with sorrow. "I just wanted to sit in my seat and fly." Nathan leaned closer and said quietly, "You still did, Grace, but now, every passenger on this flight knows exactly who you are. And when we land, what will you be?" Grace's eyes narrowed fractionally before softening as she answered, "I'll be exactly who I've always been, only a little louder about my rights." As the cabin lights dimmed in preparation for the meal service, the atmosphere shifted. Passengers stirred, stretching and flipping through magazines, yet the silence that followed the incident remained palpable. Ava remained in the galley, her gaze fixed on the beverage cart, as if searching for an escape from the reality of her actions. Deep inside, she felt the first true pangs of remorse, knowing that by the time the flight landed, the woman she had so callously assaulted would not vanish into obscurity. Grace had become the embodiment of defiance, a symbol of dignity that Ava could never erase. The cabin slowly regained a semblance of routine as flight attendants moved through the aisles with quiet efficiency, trays clinking softly, and the low murmur of conversations resumed. Even the engine's steady hum seemed to acknowledge the gravity of what had transpired. Grace held a glass of sparkling water in her hand, the droplets of condensation gathering like tiny, silent witnesses to her ordeal. Despite her peaceful exterior, her mind replayed every moment: the crack of Ava's hand, the shock of the slap, the oppressive silence that had followed. That silence had spoken volumes, a resounding indictment of a society quick to judge based on superficial appearances and entrenched biases. Across the aisle, an older gentleman, who had earlier offered a hesitant apology for his silence, leaned forward once more. "Miss, I want to apologize," he said softly, regret coloring his tone. I should have spoken up sooner. I didn't. Grace turned her head, her eyes calm and forgiving, yet resolute. It wasn't that I didn't care, he continued, now speaking with a trembling certainty. I was just unsure if it was my place to get involved. Grace's gentle reply, coming in a steady murmur, was simple yet piercing. It always is, and silence is a choice. Her words resonated with the strength of someone who had endured too many quiet injustices in her time. Meanwhile, Nathan's phone buzzed again. He no longer exchanged quiet messages with assistants. He was preparing for something far larger. Already on the phone with Velum Airlines senior executives before boarding, he now reviewed a document titled Policy Revision Draft, Incident 717. The page was filled with notes detailing new protocols for in-flight accountability, real-time passenger verification before any removals, and mandatory ethics retraining for all supervisory flight staff. It was clear, Nathan was not merely interested in rectifying what had happened to Grace. He was determined to overhaul a system that permitted discrimination and cruelty to persist unchecked. Back in the galley, Ava's world was crumbling. The weight of her decisions pressed upon her, as evident in the way she numbly scanned the passenger manifest from the overhead bin. There in row 3A was the name Grace Bennett. No red flags, no notes of exception, just a name that stood as a testament to the unyielding spirit of a woman who had never truly been given a chance. The intercom crackled, and Captain Reynolds' calm, even voice announced the start of the descent. Ladies and gentlemen, please fasten your seatbelts and return your tray tables to the upright position. Thank you for flying with us. Grace quietly buckled her seatbelt, casting one last glance at the city skyline emerging from soft clouds, while Nathan leaned in and said lowly, "They'll be waiting at the gate." When Grace turned to ask, "For me?" Nathan nodded once, his expression unreadable yet resolute. "And for you?" Grace pressed, a flicker of defiance in her voice. "You didn't ask for a scene," Nathan replied. "All you did was stay in your seat." In the galley, Ava wiped sweaty palms against her skirt and inhaled deeply. Staring at her own reflection in the stainless steel door of the beverage cart, she saw a person unrecognizable, a person who had once wielded power indiscriminately and now teetered on the brink of losing everything she had built over a decade. 10 years spent managing red-eye flights, missed birthdays, rerouted layovers, and training younger crew members were collapsing into insignificance under the harsh light of accountability. Ava had always believed in the system, in the order she maintained, but now she had become emblematic of the very injustice she once enforced. Throughout the descent, the pressure built both inside the plane and within the hearts of those who had witnessed what occurred at 35,000 feet. For Grace, each minute passed as a reminder that her ordeal, born from an act of unchecked cruelty and discrimination, was sparking change. A change that would not be forgotten. Nathan's silent preparations and his insistence on systemic reform signaled that this was just the beginning of a reckoning, one that would reach far beyond a single flight. As the plane's wheels touched down and the cabin lights brightened in the glow of American twilight, it was clear that Grace's dignity had ignited a flame of transformation, a promise that those in power would soon face consequences so monumental as to leave no room for silence or prejudice. Grace shifted in her seat as the aircraft prepared for landing, her gaze fixed on the sprawling city below, a tapestry of lit-up rooftops and winding streets growing larger with every passing second. With quiet determination, she fastened her seatbelt and took one last measured sip of water before handing the glass back to the attentive crew member. In first class, no one dared to speak to her now. Every pair of eyes that had once looked away now watched her with a mix of awe and cautious respect. She had become the epicenter of a profound reckoning, a living reminder that injustice and cruelty carry consequences. Nathan, ever vigilant and steadfast, leaned over and asked with quiet concern, "You all right?" Grace offered a single measured nod and replied, "I'm just tired." His voice softened as he continued, They'll try to apologize later to gloss it over. But don't forget, you don't owe anyone your grace. Grace's eyes met his, and she murmured with a hint of resolve, I'm not doing this for them. Nathan's faint smile spoke volumes. Pride and determination shone behind his eyes. From row 2D, a well-dressed passenger in his early 50s, clad in a pressed blazer and sporting a polished watch, cleared his throat hesitantly. He leaned forward and said, Miss, I didn't speak earlier, but I just wanted to say, I'm sorry. You didn't deserve that, and I hope whatever awaits when we land brings about change. Grace offered a brief nod. No need for lavish speeches or lectures, just a quiet acknowledgement of the truth that silence had its own consequences. And with that, the plane touched down softly on the runway, its tires kissing the asphalt with a gentle bump. A ripple of motion passed through the cabin as passengers adjusted their positions. Seatbelts were loosened, and phones began to glow again with normalcy. Yet, for Grace, the weight of what had transpired still clung to her like an indelible mark. As the aircraft rolled to a stop at Riverport International, Captain Reynolds' voice resonated through the cabin in a calm tone. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to Riverport International. Please remain seated until we reach the gate and the seatbelt sign is turned off. On behalf of our crew, thank you for flying with us. In the front of the plane, two crew members discreetly moved toward the door. Ava, who had served as the lead flight attendant earlier with so much unyielding cruelty, saw them from the galley. One of the crew, the purser, held a folder embossed with Ava's name, and then Ava's eyes caught sight of two men standing just beyond the jet bridge glass. One was donning an airport security badge, and the other sported a lanyard bearing the airline's logo along with a sleek black executive card that few ever saw. Ava's breath caught in her throat. She sensed that these were not friendly faces. Grace noticed them too. Without a word, she turned her head slightly and then lowered her eyes, letting silence speak for her, as it had so many times before. Nathan glanced at his watch and muttered, "They're early." As the plane came to a final stop, the familiar chime of the seatbelt sign signaled an end to in-flight tension and the beginning of something far more consequential. The aircraft doors swung open, and a rush of cool airport air wafted through the cabin. Immediately, a commanding voice rang out in clear, resonant tones. "Ms. Ava Harris, please come with us." Ava froze. The sound of her own name, pronounced with finality, reverberated like a judge's gavel. In that moment, every passenger in first class held its collective breath. Heads turned and hushed whispers spread like wildfire. Ava's once assured face drained of color. Where once she strode confidently along the aisle, each step now carried the weight of crushing shame and the inevitable collapse of her authority. For what felt like an eternity, Ava lingered for a split second in the aisle, her eyes momentarily meeting Grace's. Grace did not offer a look of satisfaction or scorn. She simply watched with a steady, dignified calm. That fleeting moment, silent and laden with meaning, was more devastating to Ava than any harsh words could have been. Ava followed the two stern-looking men down the aisle, a path she had once walked with authority now transformed into a descent into disgrace. Every row she passed became a stark reminder that the power she had wielded so carelessly had evaporated, leaving nothing but vulnerability and humiliation in its wake. Passengers instinctively gave her space, as though failure was contagious, and even Nathan remained seated, his gaze fixed on Grace as a quiet beacon of resilience. After a few long moments, Grace slowly rose and gathered her belongings. Nathan came to her side and asked gently, "You ready?" Grace adjusted the strap of her bag over her shoulder and answered in a tone steady with determination, "I've been ready ever since she slapped me." Together, they strode toward the door, not with explosive vengeance or overt aggression, but with the unwavering dignity of individuals who need not raise their voices to be heard. The bright terminal lights struck Ava in the eyes as she exited the plane, but that brightness felt harsh and unyielding. a spotlight that stripped away any semblance of the power she once commanded. Ava was led past familiar faces, airport staff she had once joked with during layovers, crew members she had trained into confident professionals, even a ground marshal who had congratulated her on diffusing mid-flight conflicts. Now, no one offered a smile. Instead, they watched as if witnessing the slow, painful collapse of a once powerful figure. News like wildfire in a bustling terminal spread swiftly. It was evident that this was no minor incident, but a seismic moment that would alter the way the airline conducted itself. Soon after, Ava was ushered through a side door meant for executive service, once a privilege, now transformed into a corridor of judgment. The passage, lined with frosted glass walls and commemorative awards, offered no comfort. At its end lay a small conference room where two impeccably dressed individuals waited, a woman in a navy blazer with the airline's emblem embroidered on her chest, and a man in a tailored suit clutching a thin folder. They did not stand to greet Ava. Instead, the man addressed her in a flat, uncompromising tone. "Miss Ava Harris, please have a seat." Ava slowly sank into the chair, folding her hands tight in her lap. The woman opened the folder and began reading a summary of the infamous Flight 777 incident in a tone that was clinical, firm, and completely devoid of warmth. "This document outlines your unauthorized removal of a verified first-class passenger, the excessive use of force, and the blatant breach of in-flight protocol. The passenger, Grace Bennett, presented a valid boarding pass and was forcibly relocated without cause or proper verification." Ava's throat tightened, her earlier bravado now a distant, painful memory. "I understand what this looks like, but—" she began tentatively. The man raised his hand as if silencing any protest. "This is not the time for explanations, Ms. Harris. This is a time for accountability and reflection." Ava's voice faltered as the weight of the evidence bore down upon her. "You struck her," he pressed, leaning forward so that every word seemed to echo in the silent room. With a trembling voice, Ava admitted, "No, I do not deny it." The woman then placed the folder down deliberately. "Then you must be aware that this incident has already reached the highest levels of the company. Mr. Hale, the majority stakeholder in Velum Airlines, has filed a formal complaint, supported by concrete evidence and witness statements. He has mandated a comprehensive review of internal crew conduct policies, with your case serving as a central example." The man folded his hands, his gaze unyielding. "Do you understand what that means, Ms. Harris?" Ava's voice was barely a whisper as she replied, "Yes, I understand." The man's next words struck like a verdict. "You are being placed on immediate suspension without pay, pending the outcome of a formal hearing. Moreover, you are prohibited from boarding any Velum Airlines aircraft or entering any related facility until further notice." Ava's lips parted for a moment as the full, harsh reality sank in. The man then rose and said, "You are dismissed. Security will escort you out." Ava stood, her legs weak and her vision blurry, and she left the conference room in silence. For the first time in her long career, she was not followed by colleagues with reluctant respect, but by security personnel ensuring she did not remain in the company's presence. Meanwhile, in a stark contrast far from the scene of disgrace, Grace and Nathan made their way through the terminal. They encountered two airline representatives in formal uniforms, their expressions a blend of tension and respectful deference. The woman spoke. "Ms. Bennett, Mr. Hale, we have arranged for a private escort to the executive lounge, and a car will be waiting to take you to your next appointment." Grace met the gaze of the representative and asked softly, "No press?" The woman hesitated before replying, "We are keeping this internal for now. But incidents like these tend to move fast." Grace sighed, a sound of both fatigue and resolve, and then said, "Then let's make sure the right story gets told." Side by side, Grace and Nathan walked through the terminal with quiet unity. Their shared silence was powerful, a declaration of resilience and dignity against an oppressive system. Passengers watched them pass by, some recognizing Nathan, others merely seeing Grace as the embodiment of a courtroom drama played out in real time. Reaching the private lounge, Nathan turned to Grace and asked, "You sure you're okay?" With a tired yet steady look, Grace replied, "I'm not broken, Nathan. I'm just reminded of who I am." Nathan smiled gently and opened the door for her. In the soft, welcoming glow of the lounge, with warm lights and quiet music in the background, Grace finally exhaled fully. For the first time since the incident, she allowed herself a moment of rest, a pause after having been humiliated in front of strangers and yet never raising her voice. That silent courage had shaken the very foundations of an institution built on exclusion and prejudice. Elsewhere, Ava found herself alone in a sparse apartment. Seated on the edge of her unmade bed, still in her stripped-off uniform with her badge removed, she sat numbly as the shock of suspension settled in. The blue duffel bag she always carried, heavy with the weight of back-to-back flights and personal sacrifices, lay untouched beside the door. The tablet that had once been her digital lifeline now remained dark on the nightstand. Ava had not touched it since the suspension took effect. As she stared into the dim light of her room, the reality of her downfall, her abuse of power and the consequences thereof, pressed in with the force of a tidal wave. In that moment, everything changed. Grace's dignified silence, Nathan's meticulous pursuit of justice, and the collective judgment of an entire cabin had ignited a spark of long overdue retribution. The story of Flight 717 was not ending in a whisper. It was about to send a resounding message that injustice would no longer be tolerated. A message that would resonate through the halls of corporate power, shaking the very foundations of a system built on elitism and discrimination. Grace sat by the window as the final minutes of the flight ticked by, her thoughts a whirlwind of emotions as the city below came into view. The sprawling grid of urban streets, the twinkling lights of rooftops, and the patchwork of neighborhoods growing ever larger with every passing second reminded her that out there, life continued, unapologetic and raw. She shifted slightly in her seat, fastening her seatbelt with deliberate care, each click of the buckle resonating like a quiet vow that she would not let this moment define her. With a final measured sip of water, she handed the glass back to a crew member whose eyes brimmed with silent empathy, for nobody in first class dared speak to her now. All eyes were fixed on her in a way that was equal parts reverence and cautious wariness. She had become the center of gravity, an emblem of dignity in the face of ruthless injustice. Nathan, ever watchful and protective, gave her a quiet nod as he leaned over. "You all right?" he asked softly, his voice full of concern. Grace offered only a slight nod and answered, "I'm just tired." His voice, gentle yet firm, continued, "They might try to dress this up with a clumsy apology later, but remember, you don't owe anyone your grace." Meeting his eyes, she murmured back with an undercurrent of resolve, "I'm not doing this for them." Nathan's faint smile, rich with pride and unspoken promise, said it all. Across the cabin in row 2D, a well-dressed gentleman in his early 50s, sporting a neatly pressed blazer and an immaculate watch, cleared his throat hesitantly. "Miss, I didn't speak up earlier, but I just want to say I'm sorry. You didn't deserve any of that, and I hope that when we land, you find the change you deserve." Grace's calm eyes acknowledged the apology with a modest nod, a silent validation that spoke louder than any impassioned speech. It was a quiet reminder that every silenced voice has consequences. Every unheard cry for justice leaves a mark. Before the plane finally touched down, the stirring sound of the wheels kissing the runway punctuated the heavy pause in the cabin. Passengers began to stir, adjusting their seatbelts and reconnecting with the mundanity of air travel. Yet none could shake off the profound gravity of what had unfolded at 35,000 feet. As the aircraft rolled into Riverport International, the softened hum of the engines was replaced by Captain Reynolds' measured announcement, Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to Riverport International. Please remain seated until we've reached the gate." His words, calm and professional, barely masked the seismic shifts happening behind the scenes. Near the front of the plane, discreet but unmistakable signals of accountability began to form. 2 crew members moved purposefully toward the door. From her post in the galley, Ava Harris saw them and felt a surge of dread. The purser clutched a folder embossed with her name, and, almost simultaneously, she noticed 2 men standing outside the jet bridge. One bore an airport security badge, while the other wore a lanyard carrying the emblem of Velum Airlines and clutched a sleek black executive card reserved only for high-level staff. Their presence was an ominous harbinger. Their silent gazes spoke of a storm that had already begun brewing. Grace, too, noticed the 2 men as she sat silently. She didn't need to say a word. Her calm demeanor in the midst of chaos told the entire story. Nathan glanced at his watch and murmured, "They're early." As the plane settled and the familiar chime of the seatbelt sign signaled the end of in-flight protocols, the doors swung open. A rush of cool airport air swept through the cabin as the next act of this unfolding drama began. Immediately, a commanding voice resonated through the cabin's speakers. "Miss Ava Harris, please, come with us." Ava froze. The sound of her own name, delivered with such finality, shattered every illusion of authority she had clung to. In that moment, every passenger in first class felt the weight of judgment. Heads turned and hushed whispers spread like wildfire across the cabin. Ava's face drained of color, as if all the vitality had been leached out by the force of retribution itself. Time seemed to slow as Ava hesitated in the aisle, her eyes briefly catching Grace's, an encounter laden with 1,000 unspoken words. Grace did not scowl or smirk. She simply fixed Ava with a silent, implacable stare that spoke of both sorrow and hard-won dignity. That brief moment, heavy with significance, proved more shattering than any verbal rebuke could have been. Ava was then forced to follow the 2 stern-faced men down the aisle, each step diminishing the once mighty stature of her presence. Every row and every seat passed by on that descent was a reminder that the power to humiliate and dehumanize vanishes in an instant, leaving only the raw vulnerability of human shame. As the crew and passengers absorbed the impact of Ava's downfall, Grace rose slowly, gathering her belongings with quiet determination. Nathan, ever the supportive ally, stepped at her side and gently asked, "You ready?" Grace adjusted the strap of her bag over her shoulder and replied in a measured tone, "I've been ready ever since she slapped me." Together, they walked towards the door, not with the explosive theatrics of vengeance, but with the dignified calm of those who have seen too much to be undone by a moment of cruelty. Outside the aircraft, as the cool terminal lights gleamed harshly upon them, Ava was led away by security like a condemned inmate, an enduring symbol of everything that can go terribly wrong when prejudice is allowed to flourish unchecked. Back inside the terminal, news of the incident spread quickly and irreversibly. Grace and Nathan were soon greeted by 2 airline representatives, their expressions carefully composed, yet unmistakably serious. "Ms. Bennett, Mr. Hale," the woman began, her tone formal and measured. "We have arranged for a private escort to the executive lounge. A car will be waiting to take you to your next appointment." Grace's eyes, steady and unwavering, flickered with a mixture of exhaustion and resolve as she inquired softly, "No press?" The representative hesitated before replying, "We are keeping this matter internal for now, but cases like these tend to move fast." Grace sighed, a sound imbued with both relief and determination, and said, "Then let's make sure the real story is told." Side by side, Grace and Nathan proceeded through the terminal with a united silence that spoke of mutual strength and an unbreakable commitment to justice. Passengers passing by recognized Nathan, some casting admiring glances at Grace, whose graceful composure in the face of adversity evoked images of a courtroom drama played out in real time. As they entered the private lounge, Nathan turned to Grace with concern. "You sure you're okay?" With the fatigue of a long battle etched onto her face, Grace met his gaze and said quietly, "I'm not broken, Nathan. I'm just reminded of who I am." His hand reached out warmly as he opened the door for her, and together they stepped into a softly lit space where gentle music muted the memory of pain. For the first time since the incident, Grace exhaled deeply, reclaiming a measure of the peace that had been so cruelly ripped away from her. Her silent strength had struck a blow at the heart of an institution built on exclusion and unchecked power. That evening, as darkness enveloped the city and the night began its quiet symphony, Ava returned to her small apartment with a heart heavy with regret and an unspoken desire for transformation. Sitting before her laptop, she did not seek out news updates or the relentless scroll of social media. Instead, she opened a new document, a blank page upon which she began to write, not an apology for the sake of corporate protocols, but a candid reflection on the choices that had led her to this moment. The words flowed hesitantly at first, then with increasing urgency, a confession of the cruelties she had once thought justified, and the painful recognition of how her actions had not only humiliated another, but had betrayed her own soul. Meanwhile, in the soft glow of early morning light, Grace and Nathan sat together on the back patio of Nathan's townhouse once again, sipping tea and watching as the city awoke with the usual blur of honking horns and distant engines. The headlines were all over the news, the story of Flight 717 echoing in every corner of the media. But for Grace, the important thing was not the noise outside, but the quiet revolution that had been set in motion. The undeniable reminder that dignity and truth, when spoken with calm resolve, have the power to reshape even the most deeply entrenched systems. As Nathan gently squeezed her hand, she allowed herself a small, contented smile, a signal that even though the past could not be undone, the future was hers to claim. And in that quiet, unassuming moment, as the sun peeked over the horizon and the remnants of a once crushing day began to fade, it was clear that this story of pain, resilience, and eventual accountability was only just beginning. Grace sat quietly before her blank computer screen, a heavy reminder of a career spent ignoring the truth behind the mask of authority. No assignment compelled her to write that day. There was only the raw, unvarnished need to unpack decades of decisions made at 35,000 feet. Slowly, the words began to trickle out. "I have been trained to manage order in the skies," she typed, recalling how she memorized evacuation procedures, soothed crying babies while sealing emergency doors, and even de-escalated drunken brawls with a calm so steady it became her trademark. Yet no one ever taught her to examine the assumptions that drove her, to ask who she was truly protecting when she made those snap decisions. "I thought authority meant being respected," she continued, her fingers hovering as she paused, "but sometimes it only means having the power to humiliate and then call it policy." That thought clung to her long after the computer dimmed and the room faded into darkness. Elsewhere, Grace stepped out of a sleek town car into the gleaming entrance of Velum Airlines headquarters. The modern glass facade reflected a future she now helped reshape, a future where dignity and truth had overthrown cruelty and discrimination. Her heels clicked steadily along the marble lobby, each step a declaration that she had nothing left to prove. Inside the top-floor boardroom, a new meeting was about to begin. With Nathan at the head of the table, a bold display screen behind him flashed the words, "Seen, served, respected," the banner for Velum's groundbreaking cabin equity initiative. No longer just the face of a viral moment, Grace had become the lead consultant for guest experience reform. As executives filtered in, some curious, others cautious, she unfolded a slim leather folder filled with policy suggestions, revised protocols, and detailed interaction scripts. "The problem is not bad employees," she declared firmly, "but unchecked habits, assumptions that decide who gets the benefit of the doubt and who gets unfairly scrutinized. It is about tone, posture, and the way silence is used to build walls instead of bridges." Her words carried the weight of personal anguish and the promise of radical change. Meanwhile, in a quiet corner of the terminal, Ava Harris sat alone in her modest apartment, her trembling hands reflecting the collapse of a once powerful career. The cold reality of her suspension, the endless echo of empty corridors, and the isolation she now faced merged into one inescapable truth. She had misused her power, and that misuse had shattered lives. A handwritten email from Grace now graced her inbox, a message of honest remorse and a plea for change. "Thank you for letting your silence teach me and for letting your voice remind me," it read. Ava felt the sting of every harsh decision, every unexamined bias. She closed the email with neither tears nor anger, but with a heavy, transformative acceptance that her world was ending and, perhaps, ready to begin anew. As Flight 444 later lifted off into a soft golden sky, the first-class cabin pulsed with a calm assurance that had been absent before. Under the new Passenger Integrity Initiative, every procedure was designed to ensure respect and fairness. Passengers settled into the plush silence of their seats with a newfound sense of value. In Seat 2A, Grace rested her head against the leather headrest, not from exhaustion, but in peaceful defiance, a quiet victory over past humiliation. The gentle hum of the plane carried a promise. Real change was not heralded by dramatic fanfare, but by steady, relentless reform from within. And as Grace sipped her tea and gazed out at drifting clouds, she knew that sometimes the most powerful revolution begins with a quiet, courageous whisper. A whisper that, at last, made the world take notice.